Because trauma is such a loaded word that some people don't even identify as having trauma. It implies neglect or abuse or intentionality that just isn't there. And I'm really naming that there's a cultural deviation away from what our primitive biology needs to develop a hardwired sense of safety and an expectation that our needs are going to be met in relationship to other people.
Cue music. Places, everybody, places. We're starting in 3, 2.
Welcome to the Autoimmune Hour, where we look at the rise of autoimmune disorders. I've brought together top experts that range from doctors, specialists, nutritionists, researchers, and even those recovering from autoimmune to bring you the latest, most up-to-date information about autoimmunity and how to live your life uninterrupted.
Thank you for joining us here on the Autoimmune Hour with Sharon Sayler. Always seek sound legal, medical, and or professional advice regarding any problems, conditions, and any of the recommendations you see, hear, or read here on the Autoimmune Hour, Understanding Autoimmune, and Life Interrupted Radio. Join the Autoimmune Hour's Courage Club. Sign up now at understandingautoimmune.com. Now, back to your host, Sharon Sayler.
Welcome, everyone, to the Autoimmune Hour. I'm Sharon Sayler from SharonSayler.com, and as always, it's my honor and pleasure to be with you here on another brand new episode of the Autoimmune Hour. And you can find all the other, we're approaching 500. I think we're around 480 episodes now over at understandingautoimmune.com, including tonight's return guest. We have a couple of shows with her and her business partner and with her separately, and her name is Micaela Giles. And I'm so happy to have her returning because one of her specialties is something that I learned early on, and then I met Micaela and just was profoundly enlightened, shall I say, that my understanding that our past traumas, our past, like our childhood, and I hate when sometimes when people call them big T's, little T's. I don't do that. To me, there's Micaela agreeing. To me, a trauma is a trauma. However your brain encodes it, that's what happens. So when I learned that early on in my recovery from autoimmune, it profoundly changed my health and the way I thought about health. And so tonight we're going to talk to Micaela. Let me read her bio really quick for you because it's amazing. She is the co-founder of Origins Collaborative Care, and she is the director of the Mind, Body, Education, and Healing. She considers her most invaluable learning to be her own hard-won experience as she charted a course of healing from severe, complex, chronic illness and from the many associated losses, personal, relationship, financial, and beyond. Micaela brings nearly 15 years of highly specialized education and training and certifications, such as energy healing, somatic movement, complex and developmental trauma, polyvagal theory. We're going into all of that. Understanding the autonomic nervous system, I learned from her. And that was another aha moment, a breakthrough moment, is when I understood how big a part the autonomic nervous system plays in healing and recovery from autoimmune, as well as other things. But for me, and tonight we're just talking about autoimmune. She's also certified safe and sound protocol practitioner, among many other things. So I would just want to get to it now. Welcome back, Micaela. It's so lovely to see you.
It's wonderful to see you too. Thanks for having me, Sharon.
Now, I always love where we go in these conversations. And you and I have chatted over time since we first met a few years ago. And one of the things that has always fascinated me is how we store our memories and how those memories, just a little side note, if you talk to my family members, my siblings, we grew up in entirely different families. We did not, guys. Everything was the same, except our ages, of course. But it's interesting how our brain encodes what happens around us and how something that one person may find upsetting, the other person may find traumatic, and another person may go, huh, what was that? No big deal,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. It's true. And memory, I think people, when they have a memory of something, they assume it is pretty fixed and they're accurate. The truth is that every time we recall a memory, I think this is a fascinating tidbit, but every time we recall a memory, some bit of it is lost and something is added to it. So really, genuinely, our memories do shift and adapt over time. But of course, what you're referring to as well is that depending on so many different variables, the way someone experiences something originally is very different. And there's studies about orchids and dandelions in terms of our sensitivity and resilience. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, Sharon. Does that
No,
ring a
but that's
bell?
an interesting visual because I have both. And one is a weed in my yard and the other has a prime spot in my kitchen.
Sure. It really has to do with like our constitution and how we respond and react to things in our environment. And some people are just genetically born very sensitive, more like the orchid. There's just the right amount of water. People have all sorts of strategies, like an ice cube once a blank amount of time. Tending to this orchid can sometimes be precarious and it's very sensitive, whereas a dandelion will grow and grow and grow resiliently no matter what. So that's just, if people want to Google that, it's just a way of reflecting that some people are genetically more sensitive than others to different environmental stimuli.
And not to beat myself up if I am the orchid, dandelion, or a hybrid of the two.
That's right. No, not at all. Not at all.
I love metaphors.
Yeah,
I find them
I do too.
so helpful in relating to our world.
Yeah. Something I would love to talk about, Sharon, at some point is, for one thing, I want to dispel the notion of big T and little t altogether because, yeah, it's
I
really got to
cringe when
go.
I hear that because it's not about me from the outside putting any sort of label on what your experience was.
Yeah, and more importantly, these relational breaches that happen to us, especially pre-verbally, before we have any recollection or any ability to have a conscious memory at all, those have really the most significant impact on each and every one of us in our modern culture. I'd love an opportunity to talk more about that because that is really poorly understood and is something that we work with at Origins Collaborative Care, but it would be labeled typically as little t trauma, but what we're positing is that it's actually the most significant trauma any of us have, but we don't even like to label it that way. If you're inviting me, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about what we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Because to me, when I think about trauma, and like I said, I don't categorize it however you experience it, is that's you experience it. But I think the problem, especially from childhood things that go on, with like not only, yes, we live through the moment, but as we grow up, we're reliving the moment. And then we're like renegotiating with ourselves. Oh, that person couldn't have been, I don't know, I'm just going to throw out that mean or whatever. And then we're always retelling this story too. And so I don't think it's a conscious thing when we add or delete from our story. I just think it's how our memories work because we're
Yes.
constantly, at least my understanding of our unconscious mind is okay, we can relive it, but then we're renegotiating. If I'd only done this, or if they'd only done that, or if the weather had been different, whatever, we're renegotiating things that are impossible to change.
Mm,
But the problem for me comes in as we grow older, the context changes, and to put it into some sort of, I don't like the word proper. That's the only words that coming to mind, guys.
mm.
But some sort of context um,
Yes,
that allows us to deal with it or cope with it or move.
absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I'd love to call what I'm about to share some context for maybe helping people to understand a little bit more about what they're experiencing in their own bodies and to normalize it, even though it's not normal at all. It's not normal for us as humans, but to really name that in our modern culture, our primitive mammalian biology is really needing and expecting something extremely different from what is available really from the womb and immediately once we are born. So I want to talk about this cultural deviation. There's a brilliant researcher named Dr. Darsha Narvaez, and she refers to the evolved nest. The evolved nest, just to quickly describe what it is, it's a set of conditions that every species has evolved to come to expect for health and resilience and to thrive. And for us as human mammals, we evolved to need a set of conditions from early on when our neural pathways are just being formed that no one in our modern culture gets. So I'd love to talk a little bit about what that could have looked like in our primitive time and how that would have set us up for health and how different it is from the modern culture right now. At Origins Collaborative Care, we're calling it the original insult. Insult is a medical term And this is a little bit different. We like to use original insult instead of developmental trauma, because trauma is such a loaded word that some people don't even identify as having trauma. It implies neglect or abuse or intentionality that just isn't there. And I'm really naming that there's a cultural deviation away from what our primitive biology needs to develop a hardwired sense of safety and an expectation that our needs are going to be met in relationship to other people. And this cultural deviation and the consequences of it cause disconnection in our bodies from ourselves, our somatic experience, our sensory experience of our own bodies in infancy, and a chronic perception of threat. And that shifts our biology away from health, growth, and restoration and toward a state of protection, which is autonomic nervous system work, when we're in a chronic state of protection and disconnection from our own bodies. So that's the setup. We call it, again, the original insult. And that's universal to absolutely everyone.
I'm thinking about, we'll say, historical communities were definitely more the idea of a relationship. And usually
That's
the
right.
household had more than just mom and dad and sibling. It had other generations or cousins or whatever. So there were more of a tribe type effect going on than, and I found, I'm just going to relate it to recent history in my mind, that I understand a lot of this from my previous shows and all of that. And yet during the pandemic, the isolation was really hard. Even
Absolutely.
though I could rationalize all of that, primitive part of me still had a hard time with it.
Yes. And you were in good company there, because, again, intellectually understanding something or having context for it, it's valuable, it's important. And yet, safety is an experience that's felt in the body, and our intellectual understanding of something does not necessarily change our very reflexive, automatic experience in our bodies. And that's the system that we're really talking about, that is hyper vigilant to threat, especially in relationship. And when we're talking about autonomic nervous system dysregulation, that's our focus, is in relationship. The pandemic presents a very perfect example that is really illuminating for so many of us how fear, and it was real fear, combined with isolation, separateness, not being able to be physically touched, oftentimes separated from our loved ones and really distant, not having the social gatherings, being alone, all of that has unintended consequences. Even though on the one hand, it was all designed to keep us safe, the unintended consequences that we are seeing, this is a very significant problem for a lot of folks. It actually created suppression of the immune system in many ways, and overactive, I should say it's both, suppression in certain aspects, overreactive and hypervigilant and pro-inflammatory in other ways, consequences to digestion, consequences to detoxification. People had significant either sudden onset of chronic illness issues during the pandemic, especially that first year, and or a severe worsening of already present chronic illness issues. So it's like unintended consequences of trying to keep us safe are things that we are still working to help people heal from on the other side, those unintended consequences that are still present in their system.
Could see that from the mental and emotional level and also from the physical level, because I'm thinking of my children when they were young and in daycare situations or childhood playing situations. They were exposed to a lot of dirt and germs and everything else that when you're isolating, you're not exposed to. And I feel like my immune system regressed a little bit when I first went out into public again. I felt like my immune system had regressed a little bit because it hadn't been exposed to all of those little things in little bits instead of a big onslaught at once. I understand why we did what we did, but still, again, I'm starting to reevaluate my own response to that time and what I might do differently in the future.
I think it's a good comparison, because anytime that there's fear, it shifts our biology. We can either be in a state of health, growth, and restoration. This is the place where all healthy physiologic function happens, healthy cell turnover, normal maintenance type activities in the body, digestion and our cognition, our immune system, our detoxification system, all of these healthy cell turnover, all of those things happen when we're in that state where we feel very safe and connected. And when we're not, when we're in a stress response, because we're responding, even if it's being late to an appointment, all of those metabolic resources are reallocated toward fighting or fleeing. Again, most of the situations we find ourselves in that cause a stress response are not things we need to punch our way out of or run from. And yet, the primitive biology that we were talking about earlier from a very different time, that's still the system that we're operating with. And so all of those metabolic resources are taken away from the healthy physiologic function and toward defense. And part of that defense is autonomic nervous system, okay, adrenaline, cortisol, mobilizing blood flow and all of those resources to the limbs so that we can fight or flee, right? And then there's our mast cell system, and those are directly linked. What instructs the mast cells to degranulate is the autonomic nervous system. So I've talked about this a little before, but I can't resist saying that an autonomic nervous system that is perceiving threat instructs the mast cells to degranulate before the message has even gotten to the adrenals to release the cortisol and adrenaline from a stress response. The mast cells have degranulated. It's the first system to know. So they're working together, and the mast cells don't know what the threat is. It doesn't matter. They're the first line of defense, the really primitive thing. All these mediators, there's a 1,000 or more, probably, we think. Several hundred of them are pro-inflammatory. We don't know what the threat is. I'm going to throw everything I've got under the kitchen sink at it and hope that some of it works, right? But when you get into chronic states of protection, then you've got chronic mast cell activation and degranulation, and you're caught in what we call a threat perpetuation cycle, where now there's excess inflammation in the body and symptoms and consequences, and is draining us of energy, which is a threat, of course, to the autonomic nervous system too. And we can get caught in a vicious cycle that's very hard to step out of. And again, these are two systems in our body that are charged with keeping us safe, but they become overwhelmed with so many different things to keep us safe from that they are now hypervigilant and overreacting in a way that, instead of keeping us safe, the unintended consequences of keeping us safe, they're actually part of the problem that's making us sick. And that's really where we need to be focusing our attention and energy. And how do we work to interrupt that threat perpetuation cycle so that we can stop the inflammation and create a little more safety in our system?
And I'm thinking about how fast that happens too, because sometimes even when I get into a situation and I might feel the spidey sense a little bit like, am I safe? It's
Yes.
that question, and instead of I'm not safe, it's just okay, this feels a little odd. Where am I at? I can feel that the autonomic nervous system is already ramping itself up before I've even
Oh,
that thought, am I safe? And I have to
right.
give myself time to answer. All of that behind the scenes stuff is already ramping itself up to leap into action. And it may
That's
leap into
right.
action before I answer that question. Oh yeah, I'm safe here.
And it's wonderful if you actually have the ability to assess your environment and really consider, am I safe or am I not? And it is helpful to your system to be able to have that conscious assessment to reassure that you're actually safe. A lot of people, no matter how they're trying to reassure, of course, the system is still, I'm not sure I believe you. Your ability to do that is actually, it shows your growth in that area, being able to really be in dialogue with your autonomic nervous system and partners with it so that you can help reassure it. But you're exactly right. We're talking milliseconds, that your neuroception, which is totally unconscious, right? No conscious awareness whatsoever. Neuroception is perceiving that there may be a threat, and there may or may not be one. We don't know, but it's perceiving something familiar from the past, is awakening something, saying, hey, Sharon, this might be a problem. And again, like you said, that goes up to the brain for interpretation. But you're right, all of that cascade of things has already taken place. You're probably there might already be, like, from the mast cells degranulating, there might already be some physical manifestations of that response. Never mind the adrenaline, cortisol, or the racing heart, or all of that. But that's already all off to the races while your brain gets to work. Like, wait a minute, hold on, what's going on, and am I actually okay?
Mine was this kind of now in hindsight, you can easily say, wow, that was an overreaction, Sharon, which it was. But it's where I noticed it first was I was in a large department store, and several aisles over, I could not see the person. I heard a very loud cough, a series of
Oh,
coughs,
yes.
not just like one
Mhm.
clearing throat. It was a series of coughs. I'm telling you, the brain went off to the race. The body went off to the races. Okay, do I want to stay here? Do I want to keep shopping? That was
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
That I'm really pretty sure in myself that if that had happened, let's say 2015, I wouldn't have had the same response.
Sure. But using that example, you were able to identify consciously what the perception of threat was about. But imagine again in 2015 or now, there might be something your neuroception is picking up on that you can't identify the source. This is where the threat perpetuation cycle really gets going, where we're not sure and we start, oftentimes we'll like just really confabulate a reason to explain the distress that isn't even really a part of the narrative at all. The body is saying there is something wrong, there's anxiety happening, and we go in search. This is what the brain does. It goes in search of the problem so that it can solve the problem and make us safe. But what about a system that is confused where, like you said, disproportionate, but also when we have a disproportionate reaction, oftentimes it's the way that the body is responding to something, and really it's the past, something that has happened in the past that genuinely was threatening then. The system is thinking maybe there's something that could be similar to that happening now. But if you go in search of the solution in the present and you don't have the context for understanding that it may be something from the past, really, that is triggered, is the word. We don't use that word at OCC just because it has so many connotations with wanting to suppress or move away, or like triggered is something we need to control. But triggered is the word where it's awakening something in the body, and then how do we respond to it then? And if we don't understand some of this autonomic nervous system dysregulation and how it appears, then we assume there's something wrong with the present moment and we go in search of it until we try to identify something.
Oh, yeah, it's so surprising to me at how fast it happens. But once I had the conscious knowledge from OCC and others about this concept of, okay, your autonomic nervous system is responding, and it was not that I solved the issue, I would still run away for a little bit. But just having the conscious knowledge, okay, is this my autonomic nervous system overreacting? Is there a real threat? And I make this checklist in my mind of the other day, I was out in my yard and it was odd. I just started smelling smoke. I'm like firewood type of smoke. And I'm like,
Yes.
The Autoimmune Hour will return after these messages from our sponsors. It's great sponsors like these that keep this show coming to you every week. Be sure and stop by understandingautoimmune.com to learn more.
Times TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
and my first thought was, did I leave my stove on?
Right.
So it was interesting how even with that kind of situation, which I know is another obvious thing, you smell smoke, you're going to think about things. But my first thought was, did I leave my stove on?
Exactly. And
But by
that's
that time,
that's
my brain was already going through a whole checklist of things.
That's right. And that's actually a great example. I use that one a lot. Imagine you're sleeping. Neuroception works on the unconscious level. So you're sound asleep. but your neuroception is still scanning, even though we're asleep. And if it smells smoke, right? In other words, we don't consciously smell it, but neuroception picks up on the idea of smoke. You're going to sit up and you'll have the whole response, right? The adrenaline, the heart racing, all of that is going to happen. And then your brain gets to work to use your senses and your cognition to try and identify the source of the problem. It's not conscious yet, but that's a perfect example of how the system ideally works, so that you can go find the source of the smoke in the middle of the night, right? So that you can keep yourself safe. That's a perfect example of how it should work. But again, especially in relational settings, this is really critically important. It's when we're in relational threat, our needs are not being met. We should probably be setting a boundary, but it doesn't feel safe to do it. We should probably be saying no, but it's caught in our throat. We're in conflict with someone. We're feeling scared or threatened in some way in relationship. There are all of these ways that we are experiencing that threat response that are really sticky because they are loaded with historical things, ways that our needs were not met. Again, I want to bring it back and hopefully have another opportunity to talk about the original insult, because those memories, they're not conscious memories, they're body memories. They're sensory. The only way that we experience them, they get awakened in our body as sensation, but then they get blended with whatever the present day moment situation is. So if we feel like maybe we're going to be abandoned or rejected in a moment, right? We're feeling threatened in a relationship with someone, whether it's actually true or not, or it's the fear that we're bringing with us from the past, it's very difficult to resolve it on this level when there's a very disproportional body memory of terror or threat, big, huge anxiety that is actually about a time before we even have pre-verbally, before we even have any conscious memory of it at all. Again, without that context, it seems like what's happening right now is the urgent emergency threat. But this is where it's tricky to work with autonomic nervous system regulation, because relational threats, they're stored in the body and then we're perceiving them often very inaccurately. That's what dysregulation is in the present.
And since the unconscious mind doesn't keep time the way we keep linear
Right.
time, sometimes I've found where the current relationship, could just be a tone of voice that took me back to my fifth grade teacher, whatever it
Yes.
is. And I find that interesting, that it's like instantaneous time travel, that it all comes flooding back. And in that particular situation that comes to mind, it was not intentional on the other person's part. It was just the inflection of the voice and the breathing pattern, that kind of thing, that was like, oh my gosh, it sounded just like what happened when I was a kid. And the time travel was so rapid back to
Yes.
being that much smaller person that didn't have any, at the time, boundaries or ability to conscious ability or context to deal with whatever was going on at that time. And that was
That's
fascinating
exactly
to
right.
me, how sometimes when you talk about relationships and that kind of thing, and people will immediately take it to my partner, I need to leave my partner because, or all these sorts of bad things. But oftentimes to me, it's so out of context. It's just as simple as they raised an eyebrow at you and it reminded you of when your grandpa got mad at you, you know?
Yeah. And that's the thing. We say that very often. The body is always telling the truth. It's just confused about the time. So you can be sure that whatever like you feel in your body that would cause that moment where you're reacting or responding to a situation in the present day, the body's telling the truth. It's just confused about the time. And that complicates things, especially when you're dealing with someone else who also has an autonomic nervous system and their own historical things. So it's so very easy to have those body memories awakened and to have it confuse and muddy the present day situation. So the intensity of what we're experiencing is very real and it is alive in the body. People know this is not something that we can easily control when it's happening. And that's because it's survival driven. The reason it is so feels, especially in the really white, hot, intense moments, it feels so outside of our control because it actually is. It's getting caught in this brainstem diencephalon area, which is it's the earliest memories. Again, it's from this early time, and it's not making it up to the prefrontal cortex where we would have choice and volition and reasoning and being able to think something out. The autonomic nervous system, it controls, for example, Sharon, our breathing and heart rate. Your breathing and heart rate is just operating without you needing to be involved in it at all. That's governed by the autonomic nervous system too. It's charged with your survival. And we can think about our breathing and we can influence it. I can slow it down, I can speed it up. In both cases, that would also influence the heart rate, but we don't have ultimate control. So in other words, just like someone will necessarily have to draw a breath, it won't be their choice. The ANS will insist that they draw a breath underwater at a certain point in time. Likewise, when we are really awakened with something that previously had been a threat to our survival, and I want to like flag that threat to our survival at a younger point in time, then the ANS will take over and promote whatever strategy it thinks is best, usually based on whatever worked best from us in our early development. So I want to say, like, most people often did not, this is not true for everyone, but most people maybe were not actually in life threat with their parent or caregiver in their young childhood and early development. But what we are saying is absolutely true, is that as dependent mammals, our perception was potential life threat, being cast off, not being accepted. Again, delays in caregiving when we're a completely dependent infant is experienced in the body as life threat to an infant. So those body memories are in us. And they're very real. They're very primitive and they are autonomically governed. So we don't have control in those moments. We have to have so much compassion for ourselves and other people who are often reacting in that reflexive way.
Wow, a thought came up to my mind of when I was raising my first child. This was the conventional theory, and now how much I'm learning about conventional theory nutrition when I was growing up is totally different than conventional theory now. But back then, the conventional theory was if you had a fussy baby, let him cry it out. And what I just heard is that's not a good strategy.
No, and here's the thing, and this is why we call it the original insult, because so many of us were instructed exactly, we wanted to do the very best that we could for our kids. The instructions and the recommendations that we've been given about how to care for our kids, in many cases, are really causing what the experience is dorsal, life threat. So in other words, the experience, it works to let an infant cry it out, like eventually what is learned helplessness, no one's coming. It's dorsal life threat, and the infant gets quiet eventually, which is the dorsal response, which is immobilization or freeze. As we know, it's when the other strategies aren't working. Crying would be an example of the fight or flight response, like trying to mobilize to get your needs met using the sympathetic energy of the autonomic nervous system. And dorsal is the response that happens when those strategies did not work and there's a need that is not being met. And so there's collapse. And that is experienced in the body as life threat, which is so hard to hear. And I want to name this right now because I'm a mother. I have a mother. This is painful to feel like, oh my goodness, some of these choices that were made were experienced like this. I even had an experience with my sweet son who is 28 years old, where I needed to be hospitalized and separated from him for the very first time when he was 13 months old. And the story from my mother and brother is that he was inconsolably crying for more than 36 hours before he got to see me again. And I know that experience lives on in him. It's very obvious. His perception of rejection or abandonment is so strong. And it is such a body-based feeling because he couldn't understand where I went. We couldn't explain it to him. It was just that mom is gone. I was still nursing him at that time, right? Food is gone. Mom is gone. Like what I know for safety, I've been abandoned in that way. So much compassion. This is why we call it the original insult. It's a cultural deviation. And that's why it's ubiquitous and it applies to literally everyone in our modern culture. Sharon, would you mind if I explain what our primitive biology actually does want and need from the perspective of the evolved nest?
Absolutely, because I have so many questions about everything from what should be done differently or
Mm,
whatever. So yes, please let's go to there and then
okay.
I'll be able to formulate
So
better questions.
very briefly, you had touched on the fact that even in earlier cultures, there was more family, more community, more support, all of that. We're really going back even beyond that before recorded history. There's a wonderful video, again, Darshan Narvaez, she's a brilliant researcher that talks about the evolved nest. And she really describes there's like all of human history. And then this little section of it is this more modern, where we had separated and had land and all of these other recorded history things. This is where the cultural deviation really began. Before that, and again, this isn't me making this a utopia that I'm saying we need to go back to this at all. I want to really be clear about that with everyone. And obviously that's not happening. I'm just saying we need to learn what our biology is wanting and needing so that we can work with it rather than fighting against it, because that is making everyone really sick. So to go back though to what our biology is needing, mammalian primitive human biology, ultimately, mom would have a baby would be born in a community with loads of support. The entire pregnancy would have been experienced in a very caregiving, relational way. Yes, we are designed actually for really big threats like potential starvation or a predator in the woods or things like that. But what we are not built for, and we do not know, is relational lack of safety. So when we lived in these tribes, cooperation was something really organic, because in order to be a beneficiary of the tribe, shared food gathering, shared infant care, shared fire tending, shared everything. If you were hurt or injured, you needed the care of the tribe. So it was like it inspired you. It was a self-governing system because everybody needed to do their part to receive these life-giving, life-saving benefits of being cared for. Our biology expects we need to be in safe feeling connection even today, even though we have Grubhub and we can order our groceries and all of that, right? Our biology still wants to be in really deep, safe community and connection with our family and an extended community. And so I want to name that. And then as an infant, things that we could never hope to offer our infants in modern day culture, right? There was several allo mothers who helped with nursing responsibilities, helped to take turns so that mom could sleep and the baby was still attended to the whole time. For the most part, the baby was worn and carried and interacted with on request, on like throughout all the time for 4 years. No way, of course, can we ever, right? Parents, they're on their own, they're not sleeping enough. Like it's already a setup for failure for the parent because there's not like that support so that they're getting adequate sleep and help with the child rearing. But to bring it back to the infant in primitive times, what that meant was an infant that is having their needs met during the time of neural development. For humans, our heads are so big that we actually have to be born much earlier than any of our other mammalian species would have to be, because our head would get too big and we should not be able to get out. And so we have an external womb experience, which means that so much of that neural development happens in the months and years, early years after that we're born. So all of these, basically the autonomic nervous system that we're all working with is the one that was developed during these pre-verbal times, but before age 2. So you're picturing this child that for 4 years is being attended to moment. It has an autonomic nervous system that absolutely expects for its needs to be met, that it is going to be cared for. But as importantly, it is so tuned into its own body sensations, its stimulus response, which means that it knows it can go on now that it's older, something will happen in the body, and it would know to attend to it and respond to it in some way, that it actually means something to pay attention to. Whereas what happens in our modern culture, infants are forced to disconnect from their own soma. That is what dorsal or dissociation is. It's too painful of an experience, so we leave. And it's not a consciously painful experience on that level. It's just a life-threatening intensity that is felt as sensation in the body. The same way that if you were to get into a car accident, we can all imagine how intense that would feel. That's the experience of the infant that is dependent on its adult caregivers, but there's been a lapse in care. So it does not know that it will survive. And so when that happens, we are forced to disconnect from our own soma, and we have a chronic perception of threat that is built into our autonomic nervous system. And that disconnection follows us all throughout our lives. We are a species that is very much in our heads. We are very much the kind that overrides. We keep pushing when we're too tired. We show up when we really do not have the resources to do things. We're ignoring pushing through pain, medicating discomfort. Like this is the consequence of disconnection from ourselves. And finally, we manage our safety through other people. That's a learned behavior, meaning we needed to stay in connection with our adult caregivers to survive when we were young. You brought up that example, like now you're an adult, you have agency and choice and all sorts of different ways of handling any given situation. As a child, your survival depends on being in relational connection to an adult caregiver. So we learn to manage our safety through the adult caregiver. And that follows us into adulthood, where we manage our safety outside of ourselves rather than inside of ourselves. That's a mouthful, I know, but that is where we are.
I definitely have a yes and there.
Mm-hmm.
But yes,
Most people do. Yep.
And I don't want to.
I like being challenged, Sharon. So go ahead.
Yeah, my first thought was rather fatalistic. Oh, I'm screwed.
No.
So if we had the dissociation and going into dorsal, those sorts of things as a child, and maybe we're fairly self-sufficient adults now, yeah, we can see parts of us that are dissociated. The parts of us like, okay, come back home, come over, come back here. Are we screwed, or can we learn to
No.
reparent
I,
ourselves?
yes, great question. And I love that, because that's exactly what I say in class at some point. I go, we wouldn't be here if it was just like, I'm just letting you know we're all screwed. I promise there's a way to address this. And just to even say the word dissociated, people often, that's a term that dissociation means disconnection. That's what it means. So there's assorted ways. It does not necessarily mean that there's the dissociated experience of being out of your body, but it is actually out of body. If we're thinking constantly, if we can't have a moment of silence, we have to have TV or podcast on at all times. If we are working and can't do still, if we doom scroll Facebook or are mindlessly eating or shopping or using alcohol to numb, we're courting numbness in an assortment of ways. We all have all sorts of different ways of doing that, but we are disconnected, which means we're dissociated away from our body's experience. And also, we're generally ignoring this system that is charged with survival. It doesn't like to be ignored. It's like it escalates its signals until it gets your attention, because there's value in what it's saying. That's ultimately what's really very important here. And the reparenting ourselves is literally about connection. It's not so much a psychological phenomenon, although we could work with it that way, like a little me version, and really relating to certain things as like a parent would. But the truth of it is, what we're really trying to get back to is, how do we undo the consequence of the disconnection that happened at that early time, which means invitation to be deeply attuned to our body's experiences. We at OCC, we work with polyvagal theory a lot. Our population is coming to us most of the time with really severe and complex chronic illness. So a lot of pain, a lot of symptoms, a lot of discomfort in the body on this level. That's a unique a population that is uniquely challenged in feeling safe in their bodies, right? Because their bodies are screaming at them, please, something's wrong. But we have developed, thankfully, a way to really meet this population and be able to develop safety even for them, to get back to where's the miscommunication happening here? It's like an estranged relationship, Sharon. It really is. The parallels are exactly spot on. There's miscommunication happening. The ANS and the us as a conscious human, we're not understanding each other very well. We've been impatient and neglectful, and we've been ignoring. We have not been very good listeners. And this one's yelling now to try and get its point across. It's like that. And how do we reconnect and start to build a little bit of trust? And we at OCC, we're like the marriage counselor or the mediator. I think what they're trying to say is like that, because the communication is so broken down. But that is the path back. And we're seeing it. It's really, our program has developed quite a bit over the last 2.5 years. And we recently revamped it. We have a class that started in March. They're thriving in such beautiful ways based on this new understanding and approach. And it really has everything to do with starting here, reconnecting to our bodies and learning how to trust and really see that our bodies, for as much as they seem like they're failing us, are actually, they're never giving up on us. It's just about the communication and learning to understand it differently and working with it differently to restore the way that nature intended for us to be in connection.
That's so powerful to understand, as well as I wanted to bring up, though, just to speak a little bit to the fact you went through fairly quickly things like overeating or listening to, always having to have the television on or something like that. those
Mhm.
sorts of things. I'm curious. Part of me has been taught like, oh, that's just a bad habit.
Mm-mm.
And I was hearing, yeah, I was hearing this. It's more than just a bad habit. You can, force will yourself out of a bad habit, supposedly. I've never been able to do that. And talk a little bit about this idea that some of these coping mechanisms, that's my word, I don't know what your word would
Yes.
be for that, but some of these coping mechanisms actually just look on the surface like, oh, you just need more willpower.
Please, everyone, if you hear me say anything today, it's so not true. A body that is healthy, a body that feels safe, chronically safe, right? In other words, I like that we talk about being chronically unsafe. That's what dysregulation is. But a body that truly, genuinely feels safe and cared for is one that would have adequate mitochondrial energy. I want to really name this especially as we are approaching middle age. Most people's mitochondria is mitochondrial inefficiency. It does not have enough energy left to be able to perform all of these functions. And that in and of itself is a way that we find ourselves in conservation of dorsal, even though it may not even have a depression or loneliness or a story associated with it. But if anybody knows the feeling of just basically the switch has been flipped, right? The breaker is off, like you are done, you are in conservation. Maybe it's at the end of the day, but like you can barely, you're immobilized. That is actually the body. It's too metabolically costly to keep pushing any longer. And there's a way that, especially then, when that this prefrontal cortex takes a lot of fuel, Sharon, a lot of energy. So when we have pushed and we're exhausted, and in general, we don't have enough energy to do all of the things, we'll get to a certain point at the end of the day. And most people will recognize that 5, 6, 7 p.m. is when some of these behaviors that you were saying, maybe they're bad habits, they really are coping, they're numbing. And we don't have the energy to bring I would prefer to be doing this because later it will serve me to have gone to bed early, or it would have been better to make myself a nourishing meal. That part of our brain is totally offline because it takes too much fuel. So what we're dealing with is like our reptilian part of our brain. It only cares about helping you to survive right now. And what it is helping you to survive right now might be doom scrolling. It's an analgesic. It might be mindlessly eating. It's analgesic. It's taking us away from the discomfort that is present in the body. There's so many different ways that we do that, but it is involuntary. There's not volition there. In fact, you can check with yourself. Am I in dorsal would be, do I even feel like I know I don't really want to be doing this activity, but do I really have volition? Could I invite myself up to take a nice hot bath and just be quiet or take a rest? Or am I like really like I'm watching myself and I'm like addicted almost to this thing, which by the way, a lot of these are high dopamine reward behaviors. And that's part of what incentivizes us toward them. Sharon, we could do a whole show on dopamine pathways, but we'll skip that for now. Let me just say this one thing. The body that is rested and safe, it is not a procrastinating body. It is not a lazy body. It is not one that doesn't care to do anything. If you're experiencing yourself this way, it is not a personal failing. It is not a character defect. You are not like all the ways that we are like feeling bad about ourselves. Please, this is your nervous system saying, I'm cutting the breaker. Literally just the same way all the energy like in a house, if there's a surge of energy, the breaker flips so that we don't burn the house down. That's literally what dorsal is trying to do, prevent further injury in the body. And then it comes out in some of these behaviors that it's trying to help you conservation of energy rather than restoration of energy. That requires our prefrontal cortex to get there. That means we have to feel safe enough, connected enough, and have enough energy left over to bring this on, where it would be like, what would really serve me now would be a gentle yoga practice, right? Like that requires a different level of cognition and energy that usually is depleted, especially toward the end of the day. And for some of our chronic illness people is never back online fully. So we have to work with it that way. And part of it is not beating ourselves up about it. Please be gentle with yourself, everybody.
Oh, I love that. And just for a little bit of clarification, go through the levels again because dorsal's that freeze level, but go through the levels again so people can see that once you
Yeah.
hit that level where you're at.
Yeah. So the way that it's a hierarchy, the autonomic nervous system is a hierarchy, and we are a mammalian species, which means that we depend on other people for survival, literally. And so the most recently evolved part of our autonomic nervous system is known as the ventral vagal system. This is actually the vagus where it travels. It innervates the striated muscles of the face and our pharynx and our larynx and our middle ear, how it perceives human voice or other types of sounds. Because it's our social engagement system, it is the part of us that, to start with, tries to stay safe using connection, using being in relationship, relating. Even a conflict, you would start by using your ability to relate and think about someone else's feelings, be a good listener, try to be patient, right? These are the kinds of things that you would bring to try to resolve a conflict, let's say, using your mammalian ventral vagal system. That is the state of safety and connection. In that place, that's where all that healthy physiologic function happens. All health, growth, and restoration, healthy cell turnover, immune function, digestion, detoxification, all of that happens in the ventral vagal state. And then let's say you cannot resolve whatever perception of situation or perception of threat with your ventral vagal system, you'll move into sympathetic. That was evolved before the ventral vagal system. Sympathetic, there's really two very distinct flavors of that. As people know, it's fight or flight. They're very different energies. Fight is a little more aggressive, hold your boundary. I will see if I can mobilize energy to really stand my ground here. It tends to have like critical thinking or blame or anger or agitation energy to it. And then there's flight, which is a little more on the running side, anxious, maybe taking on other people's stuff, feeling like anxious or scared or wanting to hide and run away. So that's further down the ladder, closer to the dorsal system. We will employ these mobilization strategies to try to stay safe. And if they don't work, then we have to resort to immobilization. And that's a state of conservation. It is the gazelle that is running from the lion, right? And it gets caught and then goes to freeze, right? All of the adrenaline and cortisol is still in that gazelle's body, but it goes to immobilization partly to endure. It's an analgesic. It helps to endure the pain that may be about to happen before death. It's also an effective strategy because maybe the lion gets distracted and there's an opportunity to hop up and get out of here, right? So it's an effective strategy on that level too. And then people know that maybe they've seen videos where if the gazelle were able to get up, it actually has to shake that sympathetic energy out of its body, which is something that we humans don't do enough of, and it gets trapped. That energy gets trapped in our bodies, which is part of what we end up feeling. For those of you who wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when cortisol rises in our bodies, and then you're like sitting up awake, that is the adrenaline and cortisol, the excessive adrenaline cortisol that is trapped. That's mobilization energy trapped in the body. So conservation, this is immobilization, numbing, freeze. It's basically, again, it's tripping the breaker to keep you safe and protected from doing any further damage by trying to mobilize on top of a system that doesn't have the energy to do it.
Fantastic. Now I want to go tangential really quick though. If you're one of those people that wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, so you're saying that's the cortisol and the adrenaline. What if I shake like a wet golden retriever? Will I be able to go back to sleep?
This is not necessarily recommended in the middle of the night, maybe not, but I'm glad you asked, because trying to figure out let's let go of historical things that are stored in the body. Every day, I know we are all encountering reasons that we get mobilized into sympathetic. Figuring out how to shake or move energy, exercise, walking, even pressing your hands up against the wall and really engaging those muscles, but shaking, intentionally doing something to discharge some of that energy as a practice is great for being able to sleep through the night. It sometimes takes a little while to get there, but that is something that is quite effective, actually, helping people to avoid that 3 a.m. cortisol bump.
Okay, so to release the energy before bed instead of in the middle of
Yeah.
bed. Okay.
Yeah. And also, a body that we're ignoring the entire day will speak to us at night. What we see a lot with our members, and some people have trouble falling asleep, but what we see a lot with our members is that there's so much exhaustion that people do fall asleep. It's that dorsal conservation allows to fall asleep, and then just enough rest is also restored in the body that when that cortisol spike happens, they're up, and then all of a sudden there's ruminating happening and perseverating. But remember, Sharon, as it's the body's experience of safety or threat that initiates the whole process. The thinking is what is going on? All the perseverating is like trying to work out whatever problem the body is perceiving.
Oh, wow. Okay. I could go on and on, but we're just about out of
Have
time.
me back.
We will, absolutely. But I want to make sure that we are able to tell a little bit about Origins Collaborative Care. We've dropped little seeds along the
Yeah.
path here, but tell a little bit about Origins Collaborative Care and how people can also get a hold of you guys.
Yeah, thanks. So Origins Collaborative Care was started because as you mentioned, I had a really painful and extensive chronic illness journey, 11-year odyssey that was really very painful. And my healthcare provider is my colleague right now. She is the one who helped support me during that time. And we really wanted to create a practice that helped to serve people who have tried everything else without success. And for those folks, as it was for me, the primary obstacle was not receiving great care. A lot of people receive the best in functional medicine or integrative care, but this obstacle of having autonomic nervous system dysregulation. So that is what we offer at our practice. We have functional medicine care available to people in Massachusetts with Jessica that includes the autonomic nervous system regulation as the foundation. That is the building block for all of the other healing and repair that can happen in the body. But worldwide, we can serve anyone on autonomic nervous system regulation. We have a really amazing class experience and other ways of working with the autonomic nervous system, ultimately to restore our body's capacity for healthy function and healing and repair. So Origins Collaborative Care, www.originscollaborativecare.com. And I would love you to find us on YouTube because if you're at all interested in what we do or the science behind it, we have some really great videos on YouTube as well.
Absolutely. And that's Origins Collaborative Care as well. The little @
Yes,
symbol.
yes,
Is
yes,
Origins
yeah.
Collaborative Care. Right.
Yep.
And it's a great YouTube channel. You can learn so much about this. And if you're thinking like, okay, I've tried everything, try understanding your autonomic nervous system, because that for me was one of the key components of more rapid healing, was that understanding.
Yeah.
It was on a good path, as you said, with great caregivers, but each time, every so often you find the gold nugget and you're like, oh, okay. And you'll notice a big leap. And once I began to understand at a very conscious level how the autonomic nervous system works and why it works that way, it's an amazing system, but it's one that we take for granted our whole life until all of a sudden it's dysregulated. And then we're like, not sure what's happening. And I
Exactly.
find a lot of caregivers, and this isn't, I just think it's not talked about enough, that in my early search for the right answers for my recovery, safety, trauma, all of that autonomic nervous system was never brought up. It was all about the stuff on the surface. Take care of the rash, take care of this, take care of that. That was a very physical intervention, which I'm sure saved my life. Just being able to speed up your healing and understanding the multiple layers and the multiple roots of where the
Absolutely. And in my case, Sharon, I was not, I could not get better. I did all of the things. I treated mold, I did Lyme, nothing ever really worked until autonomic nervous system regulation. And because your audience is really geared toward autoimmunity, and on the YouTube channel, there's a particular video called Anatomy of a Chronic Illness that I think your audience would find fascinating. It really talks about autoimmunity and how it is a predictable progression and why, which that is not taught in general. People think it's genetic or luck of the draw, and it actually isn't. Gene expression, certainly. The type of autoimmunity that will develop in a given person has to do with gene expression, but the path has everything to do with the autonomic nervous system. And Jessica, my colleague, explains that in the video Anatomy of a Chronic Illness on the YouTube channel.
Yes, I highly recommend that one. It's a great video. I learned a lot. And I think one thing with a lot of people who are in this process of recovering from autoimmune, and I want to say that there's, to me, I'm always uncovering more fascinating things, is I have to watch myself that I don't get to this place where I know I've done it before, where it's, oh, this is good enough. Okay, it's better than where I was. And yes, maybe I grunt and groan every morning when I get out of bed or whatever it is, but okay, but it's not there. But there's always more that we can do to help us understand what's going on for ourselves and for family members, just understanding the autonomic nervous system, and not near as trained as Jessica and Micaela are, but just my little understanding of it have helped other people. So I encourage you to check out Origins Collaborative Care and their unique way of healing and overcoming chronic long-term conditions. So thank you so much, Micaela, and I look forward to having Jessica back on soon too. And everyone, have a great week, whatever your adventures. And if you're here on YouTube at Understanding Autoimmune YouTube, please subscribe. It helps us bring our message out to a much larger audience and hit that little notice bell, I guess is what it's called, so you can get notified that every time a new interview is launched. Hopefully it's about every Friday. That's my goal. It doesn't always happen, but that's my goal, is to launch a new interview every Friday. And so thank you all, community, for being part of my healing journey, and hope to walk hand in hand with you on your healing journey. And everyone, have a great week, whatever your adventures. See you next week. Enjoy.